All right, Aaron, I am excited to have you here. We've come together to talk about employee handbooks, and we're doing this in anticipation. Next week on the 8th, we are going to be hosting a Q&A with leaders about how to mitigate the risk of having employees without sabotaging, without undermining performance. You know, when I ask, and we've conducted surveys, when we ask business leaders what's the most valuable asset in your company, they universally say, or pretty close to universally say, the employees. And when we ask them what's your greatest exposure to risk, they say the employees. And they are doing things to mitigate that risk that sometimes they feel ethically challenged by, sometimes they just don't like it, and very often they recognize that it may be alienating people. They may not recognize how much it is potentially sabotaging performance because alienated people don't perform as well, and they feel like they have to do it. So, in a week on January 8th, you and I are going to be hosting a Q&A. Folks, if you are out there listening and you'd like to be a part of that live Q&A, then by all means, reach out to me and we'll make sure to get you an invitation. Though we will have limited seating, we're happy to have you. We've got still a few seats left. Today, we're going to be talking about the handbook, the employee handbook, which is one of those things that people use in hopes of mitigating risk. Maybe not the best and first and best use of an employee handbook. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Aaron, what would you say? Oh, first introduce yourself. Who the heck are you, and why would I ask you to join me for something like
Well,
this?
for better and for worse, I'm an employment lawyer, uh, and I tend to look at the practice of employment law not first and foremost as risk mitigation, but first and foremost as helping companies do what they want to do.
Mm.
Right? Companies want to do something, whether it's a nonprofit that wants to help kids or whether it's a for profit business that wants to revolutionize home improvement, right? Whatever it is you want to do, I want to get employment law out of the way. And that's a little different, I think, from some lawyers who see their job as never being blamed for the lawsuit that happens.
When you say you want to get it out of the way, I'm imagining that you don't mean that you just want it done and dusted. What do you mean by get it out of the way?
Well, it's a constraint.
Mm.
It's something that limits your ability to do what you want to do. And in many cases, that's a good thing. If there is a hypothetical client, I mean, in all honesty, none of my clients think this way, but if there's a hypothetical client who wants to not allow women to work in their company for malicious reasons, they shouldn't be allowed to do that, right? These constraints are there for a reason. But sometimes the technical aspects of the constraints overwhelm the good intentions behind them, right? All you have to do is take a look at any company trying to employ people in the state of California, and so many employers are trying to follow the law as best they can. They're not trying to skirt it. They're not even trying to stretch it. There's just so many little tripwires and ways of getting it wrong that even if you're doing your best to be 100% compliant, you never will be, right? So my
And
job.
because of the law of unintended consequences, a lot of these things aren't good for employees either. Um,
Absolutely.
uh, let's get into a little bit the topic of the day, the employee handbook, and the title of this. I told you, we're calling this, "Hey, CEOs and owners." It's your handbook and your responsibility. And the subtitle I told you, but right as we were getting started, a lesson from Mary Barra. And I promised I would not tell you before we began, but wait until we were rolling, why I'm calling this a lesson from Mary Barra. Mary Barra, you listener at home may know, is the CEO of General Motors, and she's coming up on her 11th anniversary there in a couple of weeks. And famously, Mary Barra inherited the employee handbook, of which of course she did, that was there before she got there. And one of the components of this employee handbook was a 14-page long dress code. The dress code alone 14 pages. Now, I don't know what all Mary Barra did with respect to the dress code, with respect to the employee handbook. And I would wager that most CEOs of giant corporations like that never even look at, or at least never consider it their responsibility to do anything about the employee handbook. Nevertheless, Mary Barra famously changed the dress code from this 14-page diatribe to 2 words: dress appropriately. What are your thoughts about that change?
You know, my first thought is when you describe a 14-page dress code, how much easier it would be to sue an employer who has a 14-page dress code than a 2-word dress code. And this is the funny thing. You can have your cake and eat it too. There's all this complexity that employers introduce into their handbooks to give the illusion of control and safety and procedure. Humans are messy. Situations are complex. And a 14-page dress code is just begging for some manager to enforce it a little differently than someone else or not follow the letter, and then have a plaintiff's attorney ask, well, hey, why did you enforce this part of the dress code with Bob, but not with Tom? Does it have anything to do with the fact that Bob isn't in this protected class and Tom is, right? You kind of set yourself up with that level of specificity, because the world does not fit into a bureaucratized 14-page dress code.
And so, and I imagine that the writers of that dress code had a couple of things in mind. One was one thing after another, would happen. Somebody would dress in some way inappropriately, and they'd say, "Oh, I guess we got to add another detail to the employee handbook," which is often how employee handbooks grow and grow and grow. Is somebody will do something ill-advised, and they'll go, "Oh, I guess we need to write another policy." So if having all of this detail in the employee handbook means that one manager could increase the liability by interpreting a detail differently with one person than another, talk to me about how that may not be as great a danger with if I'm the manager, interpreting dress appropriately, perhaps a little bit differently between 2 different people.
I'll give you a different type of employee handbook policy that I loathe that demonstrates this.
Okay.
It's the progressive discipline policy. It's the series of maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 8 steps, which have this nice orderly if-then statement flavor of, if this happens, we do this. And we have the right to escalate steps and skip steps, but these are the steps. And here's how every one of those policies ends up being used in litigation. A manager will skip a step because no one will actually go through all 14 steps of a progressive discipline policy.
That's a lot of steps.
The employee's attorney will depose the manager and then grill that manager. Why did you skip these steps? Do you skip the steps in all cases? Do you have a pattern with the types of people you skip the steps and don'ts? There's so many things to ask why you went off book. It's better to say we don't have a book.
Yes. So it's having that highly specified standard that means that if you improvise in any way and try to be in any way responsive to the situation, then you've got to defend your reasons for having ventured away from, improvised off of that highly specific standard.
That type of employee handbook is operating under the illusion that we live in a world not of narratives, but of math, right? First-year law students have this idea that you've got facts plus law equal result. And if you memorize the law, and if you know the facts, you can add them together in an algebraic fashion and come up with a result. That is not how the law works. That's not how people work. People think in terms of stories and narratives, and who's the good person and who's the bad person, who's the hero and who's the villain. If you have dress appropriately and you have dealt with your employee in a reasonable way, if you've been kind, given the employee opportunities to change, made your case in a persuasive way about why the particular, um, the T-shirt saying we should sacrifice babies to Satan isn't appropriate in the workplace, right? Um, then it's much harder for that employee to sue. If you've got this very rigid, detailed policy, which you followed accurately, but in a manner that makes you look unreasonable, pinched, and like you're out to get the person, a jury's going to say, this looks like there could be something else going on here, right? Because it's the narrative that matters.
And then on the performance end of things, if I'm a doorman at a high class hotel or something like that, dress appropriately on almost every day is going to be the same. And then my manager doesn't need to do gymnastics in order to recognize that, maybe today I have a cast. Like, could I get my cast through the uniform pants or through the uniform jacket? Well, maybe. And, am I putting myself at risk if I go away from this rigidly defined uniform? Or can I simply say, yeah, that seems appropriate?
I'm going to steal a little bit of your thunder here, Aaron, because you and I work together enough that I know partially where you're going here. You have the added benefit of a dress appropriate policy, of not treating your employees like idiots, of not being the implicit message, you're a moron, and I need to specify for you what to do in every possible situation. You're telling your employees, we trust you to have judgment. We trust you to act appropriately, right? We've invested you with that trust. And that flavor will come out in litigation with your employee. And maybe even more importantly, the opposite flavor will cause the litigation in the first place, because people who feel like they're being treated like idiots get more frustrated and are more likely to sue.
So I've had a number of clients say to me, one of our core values is trust. And yet we find that our employees really don't trust us. There's this kind of us versus them mentality around here. And one of the first things that I say in those situations is, let me have a look at your dress code. Excuse me. Let me have a look at your employee handbook. And when I dig into the employee handbook, sure enough, there it says our core value is trust. And then on every other page of the handbook, not in so many words, it says, we don't trust you as far as we can throw you. We don't trust your judgment. We don't trust your ethics. We don't trust your intentions. And those three areas of mistrust are hammered home again and again and again in the level of specificity and in the language that's used in the handbook.
I see it all the time. I can also anticipate an objection that certain folks would make, that if you have something that just says dress appropriately, what about the situation where, say, you have employees with ethnic hairstyles and those are legally protected, and your manager might miss that or might interpret it incorrectly? Their idea of what's appropriate or professional may actually not be legal. My advice there is just say what you mean. Like in the handbook, say, our society has made the decision to respect and protect certain cultural presentations, and we support that. And here's what those are, right? Just do the thing. Like I see this over and over again, where I see lawyers use super technical, complicated constructions. I say, what are you trying to say? And then the person says it in a couple of plain English sentences. And I'm like, why don't you just say that?
Right. And that is one of the things that I find I am saying to myself again and again when I read handbooks. So let's jump into a real world scenario handbook. We have anonymized this handbook, but this is a handbook from a real company, and we've changed the names of the innocent to protect them. So this so-called Acme widgets, I think, begins beautifully. I love that this says legendary tales of adventure begin inside.
I will say that you've now made a promise from a literary perspective, you made a promise, you better deliver. If you say legendary tales of adventure begin inside, and you've got 120 pages of technical legal speak,
Yeah.
you've
Well,
just added insult to injury.
this handbook happens to be, I think, about 31 pages, which is, where would you put that on the how long a handbook is? 31 pages. You've seen more of them than I have.
I'd say it's on the trimmer side. I'd
Yeah.
say it's not the type of, it's not the length at which one immediately throws up their hands and says, "I'm not going to read this."
That that reflects my experience as well. And here we are at the table of contents, which is pretty that's a lot of stuff. And when I look at this, speaking of that promise that legendary tales of adventure begin inside, when we dig it with our first big look, does not read like the table of contents of a legendary tale of adventure.
And I want to be fair to folks. It is so hammered home what you got to have in your employee handbook. You got to have your FMLA notice, right? Or you have to have a separate handout, right? You got to have your EEO policy. You got to have those things.
Now, I want to. You just glossed over and breezed across something that I want to highlight. You said you've got to have your FMLA policy, and then you used a really important word, or you've got to have a separate handout. And one of the things that's remarkable to me is that these handbooks, almost every single handbook that I've ever read, is full of sterility and legalese and jargon and dry, boring crap, as if the only option we have anymore is still to give people a paper handbook that has no internet powered anything behind it.
Not even a hyperlink.
Right. What would happen to your handbook, listener? What would happen to your handbook if you made your handbook a delivery on this promise? Legendary tales of adventure begin inside. Or it delivers on whatever promise is yours that you want to make to your employees. That as a handbook narrative, this thing is actually kind of fun, kind of exciting, gives people a sense of what their responsibilities are and what you have committed to as an employer for them. And it's trim and clean, and that's all there is, except for your ability to click into anything you need to. You want to understand family leave to a greater degree than is spelled out in that way. You click, and by the magic of technology that is how many decades old now, you can get into
in college. Yeah, since college. Well, and it's one of the things I often recommend. One of my favorite phrases in advising clients is just blame the lawyers. That's what we're here for. In certain cases, a related concept is the government has an FMLA flyer, right? It's a poster. It's this is what the disclosure looks like. They've written it already. So put that in there. Say your rights under the FMLA are on the following page. This is a document prepared by the government, right? And then you can get back to your handbook. Not only are you pretty much assured of compliance, you've now deflected responsibility for this boring technical excerpt onto the government, right? So,
or even better, if you'd like to know what the government has spelled out as your rights, which we are happy to deliver to you, click here and go to the government where the government will tell you directly.
Right. That is a question as to whether or not that would be okay. Like, you as the employer have to deliver it.
Great. Maybe click here and it'll take you to another one of our pages where we quote the government.
There, exactly. In whatever you have I think the main point, and this is really important for employers, this is one of the most important meta points, is when you're making decisions on how to draft an employee handbook or anything employment related, you got to be asking, why are we doing this? And the answer can't be because best practices. It's like the
I
two
love that.
terms I hate. The two terms I hate in practicing law are market and best practices. When people say like we're negotiating an employment contract, well, it's not market. I'll be like, what's market?
Yeah, what
What's
does that
market?
even mean?
There's no going rate for the terms. I mean, you can argue about like what the average salary of a particular role is. The market is, is what two parties are willing to agree on. And best practices
Mm.
just means a thing that might be a dumb idea that's repeated enough that it's become common, right? That doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so you should always be asking why, right? To the audience out there, if your employment lawyer is telling you to include something in your handbook and you're like, this is stupid, you should say, why do we have to have this in there? And if they say, well, it's best practices, you should say, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, what's its purpose? Not
Yeah, what is its actual, explain to me what risk that we are heading off by doing this that we can't head off in a way that doesn't make us look like George Orwell, 1984.
and I would say even better than what risk are we heading off? How does this serve the audience of this handbook, which is the employee? How does this serve the employee?
Well,
Now,
I mean, can you draft a document that an employee actually is going to read through and be like, hey, that was pretty useful? I mean, that's the other piece of this, right? Checking boxes is not the primary function of an employee handbook. It should be to convey information that an employee needs in order to function at your company. By definition, the vast majority of your employees aren't suing you,
right.
right?
So let's come back to this. This again. This is a real life employee handbook. We've changed the name, but otherwise, this is exactly the handbook that a company out there is using. And this is a really good handbook according to conventional wisdom. And what you and I are really talking about is a paradigm shift, because even this like top 10%, maybe even top 5% handbook is full of gobbledygook, is going to be alienating at certain points. I've underlined here a few passages that I really appreciate in green. We're glad to have you here as a member of Acme Widgets. What a great way to begin. We could look at another handbook that I've grabbed from a bank that says welcome, just like this one does. And then the next text doesn't have anything to do with welcoming somebody to their employment. So this is doing a good job. Here's where I take exception, is where it says, please read it carefully. And then it's followed by 30 pages of stuff. 30 pages is a lot. And you just said this is a pretty trim handbook. 30 pages is a lot of writing to read carefully.
Well, I can take it a step further. When you say please read carefully, right? Why not even say in bold, no, this stuff is really important. We know that you're going to want to just skip it, but we're begging you, read the whole thing at least once, right? Like it could even sound a little bit funny. Humor can go a long way. But the neat thing about saying in plain English, no, really, you need to read this whole thing, is we've become so accustomed to boilerplate admonitions and click through
Right.
terms and conditions that when you use the things that are supposed to ensure that the person's read it, it doesn't work anymore because we've seen the same things. If you want to convince a court, we really did tell people to read this. You're going to have to do it in a way that doesn't look like the same way everyone else has done it and that no one actually does. Right? There's all sorts of litigation about whether some of these click through online things are even effective, right?
Yeah.
Because they're so ubiquitous.
I'm gonna go back again and say, what is the purpose of this document? I think part of the paradigm shift that you and I are calling for, Aaron, is that the purpose of this document is to serve the employee, because you as an organization know this stuff and they don't. And so to that end, right, if we go back to this again, This is a trim document at 30 couple pages. None of these things is clickable. So what you're asking me to do is to remember, okay, if I want to read about privacy, I've got to remember 27, and then I've got to scroll through 27 pages. How difficult is it for you to make that a clickable link? So let's talk again. Let's talk for a moment about one of the things that makes this a really good example of a employee handbook. And I've got on page on the screen one of the things that you brought up before we got onto the call, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, we're quoting some movies here, which is kind of fun. And there's a lot of connotation to go along with the denotation there, right? Like, we don't take ourselves too seriously, right? Which is good. It's also more memorable that way. And, Aaron, you said like, this is the top percent of handbooks. I want to just underline, if you're grading on a curve, yeah, this is an A handbook. I think the point here is that even the A students out there, when it comes to handbook design, we could do a lot better, right? Like just the example you gave, hyperlinks, right? Does that make it easier to use? And I think setting out values early on is important. And I think some employment attorneys shudder a little when they see values because maybe you don't act consistent with those values. Maybe those values could be misinterpreted. If a company hasn't had the conversation about what their values are and vetted it enough not to be afraid of the consequences of explicitly stating those values, they've got some work to do.
Yeah, if you aren't willing to explicitly state your values, then they clearly aren't really your values.
Or even worse, if your employment lawyer has told you not to explicitly state your values because they could get you sued, it's time to reevaluate those values.
Yeah. So when it comes to fun, right? We had that promise at the beginning about legendary adventure, right? Tales of legendary adventure contained within. We get a little bit of fun here after the table and comments with the way these values are named. That's the end of the fun.
Well, you're also totally alienating Gen Z because, Top Gun, Bill and Ted's, you're hitting my demographic, right?
So, you and I are having fun. So one of the things, and I've underlined this in green, it says, please understand that this handbook can only highlight and summarize company values and procedures, I think is a wonderful message. This handbook is a highlight reel. It's a high level summary. And then still it goes into a great degree of detail. So, that's what that little red arrow, it really is, like, how summarized can you get?
And I think that I do want to point out, play a little bit of devil's advocate. There are a few areas where a certain amount of depth and complexity is necessary. And a lot of it has to do with benefits. And I just, caveat here, I'm not a benefits attorney, but a lot of the ways employees actually use their employee handbooks is they've got a medical issue, they're going out on leave, they're switching part-time status, and the bureaucracy with which employers are forced to interact, whether it's the Washington Paid Family Medical Leave Act, that you're gonna have some stereo instructions in there, right? It's gonna be a little bit crazy. But even then, gosh, it's nice when you include some helpful examples that apply to the vast majority of your employees instead of just laying out the rules. Be like, okay, a lot of our employees want to take the following kind of leave. This is what that looks like for you. This is what it's going to look like, right? Here's an example. For a person getting paid at this amount, this is how much Washington Family Medical Leave is going to cover for you, right? It's to put it what you said a different way. Pretend you're the consumer of this handbook and you're using it. What would be helpful to you?
And so, again, I'm not suggesting that employees will never need that level of detail. The question is, with the technology that we have and the information delivery systems that we have, do you really need to present it in this single stream of data, or can you telescope this information?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And um, the other issue, and again, I don't want to present this as like primarily my thought because I know this is your mantra. Are you talking down to or over your audience, right? Are you putting things in a way that's so hyper technical that they don't understand? Or are you putting it in a way that you're insulting their intelligence because it's a pretty simple concept that doesn't need 3 paragraphs of backside covering language to convey?
Now, I'm going to go back to our document here, and I think this has been handled far better than it is in most handbooks. In most handbooks that I see, it's welcome, we're glad you're here. By the way, we can fire you at any time. So just the fact that we're 6 pages in, that we've had our fun with talk to me goose and those other kind of idiosyncratic values that gave me a little bit of a sense of fun. So we got into that first, all that kind of welcoming and making me feel good to a certain degree before it now says, don't get comfortable. We could fire you at any moment. We've talked before, you and I, Aaron, about the language of these at-will employment passages. What would you say about this at-will employment passage and the others that you see on a day-to-day basis?
This one in particular is a textbook example of an at-will employment statement. Um, I think employers have more flexibility than they think. Um, the way at-will employment comes up in litigation is often because someone has made some sort of a promise or some sort of a insinuation that the person can't be fired without cause or a good reason. And these types of statements can help, but you can use plain English. You can say, regardless of what anyone else you might think anyone else has implied to you at any point in your employment here, we have the legal right to end your employment for any legal reason, period, right? And then you can even have an explanation as to why you're including this. We're letting you know this because we want the rules of the road to be clear to you, right? That we might terminate you just for our convenience and no other reason, right? You might even forgo including that if you think that's damaging to your culture.
Yeah,
If you
even
think
that,
that
if I think of myself as a brand new employee, and this is one of the very first messages that I received, to me, it's kind of alienating. I remember, being a brand new employee at a company in California and being asked to sign this passage and just finding it very, very odd, and in at complete odds with what I was receiving from the people. And so it made me view the people with a little bit of suspicion all of a sudden.
well, it's also just if you were to create a pie chart of the employment suits that are out there, fight over at will status where someone believes that they were not at will when they in fact were at will are a small portion of that pie. Most of
Mm.
them are discrimination, retaliation, or some sort of like technical violation, like a wage an hour, right? You didn't pay me minimum wage, you didn't pay me overtime, you didn't get my commissions right, right? The idea that, well, my boss told me, oh, you're really likely to make manager in 3 years, right? And then I got fired and I said, oh, wait, I'm not at will. My manager said I was likely to make manager. If you just have something that says your employment is at will, meaning you don't have to work here if you don't want to, and we don't have to keep employing you if we don't want to keep employing you, as long as our reasons aren't illegal reasons, right?
Yeah. Now, what do you think about a statement like, according to the laws of our state, we are not entering into a contract of old, the kind where we're committing to employ you for a certain amount of time and you're committing to be an employee for a certain amount of time. Instead, in our state, the way things are arranged is that this is a day by day, we are working together and we're happy to be doing it. And as long as both of us are happy to be doing it, we're going to continue. And if either one of us at any point decides we don't want to continue this for any legal reason, we get to say goodbye and be done. Right? I mean, I'm sure there'd probably be some tweaks to that would be required, but it's such conversational, respectful, non-threatening language.
There's all sorts of ways you could approach that, including, this is a no-fault divorce scenario, right? Sometimes things don't work out, and we don't have to have a reason, and you don't have to have a reason. If it's not working out, I think you can be creative with that. I would say just run it past your employment lawyers so they can say, "Oh, have you stepped in a cow pie here? Have you unintentionally created an issue?" I think what this boils down to is give yourself license to be a little bit more creative. Give yourself license not to write the same at-will statement that everyone else has written.
Now, here's another place, and I'm changing the subject, where this very excellent, comparatively, as you said, graded on a curve, this very excellent handbook, to me, just gets to be kind of like, are you kidding me? Because how difficult would it be, for example, we've got how many classifications here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 classifications. How difficult would it be to create 5 different handbooks for each of these classifications that says you are this one? And here, because you might be interested in knowing what other classifications there are, here are the rest. That again, if I come back to the paradigm shift we're calling for is an employee handbook that serves the employee, how much easier would that be to navigate?
Just to underline that point, without naming names, I heard a truly inspirational speech from a human resources expert from a very well-known company. And their epiphany was to say, we need to stop treating only our customers like customers, and we need to treat our employees as customers, because they are. The same care, the same attention, the same drive to improve, all of that should be part of our culture towards our employees. And they made their employee handbook look like their customer marketing materials. The same convenience, the same color scheme, the same language, and the same style. And you know what it did? It actually got employees speaking the language that they wanted those employees speaking to their customers.
Fantastic.
So it's sort of like if you want someone to start being able to speak an iambic pentameter and you start speaking to them that way, they're going to pick it up. Right. Maybe that's not the best example, but it's if you want someone to use a certain writing style, you should expose them to that writing style, right? And what better way to understand what the customer should be feeling and experiencing than for the employee to have that same experience themselves?
And in the days when, what we had was some static document, and that then it makes sense that it'd be hard to do the kinds of telescoping information management that you and I are talking about. In this day and age, again, you're talking about treating our employees like customers. We know that we need to segment our customers and message them appropriately. How difficult would it be to classify, digitally, this employee as a full-time hourly non-exempt employee? I'm going to classify you that way, Aaron, and your employee handbook is going to reflect that. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, if you become promoted and you are now a full-time salaried exempt employee, I'm going to have to go into my payroll software and change that classification. That change is already happening. And your employee handbook could immediately, because of the way information management works now, reflect your new status. This is the work that we need to do in order to serve our employees as if they are customers.
I think, Aaron, you and I had the conversation earlier where I said I often have the experience with other attorneys where I'll read a paragraph that they wrote and I won't be able to understand it. And I'll say, what are you trying to say here? Like, what does this mean? And then they'll say a couple of sentences. And I'll say, well, why didn't you just write that? Right?
Let's back up for just a second, because we'll come back to this. How long have you been an attorney, Aaron?
Going on 22 years.
So 22 years of practice reading legalese. And you are looking at these documents that make the rest of us dizzy. And you're saying, I can't understand this. And telling professional attorneys, why don't you just say what you mean? And so, if you, who have 22 years into this, are looking at employee handbooks and saying, what does this mean? Why don't you just say what you mean? Just imagine, you who are listening at home, just imagine what your employees are saying when they read this gobbledygook.
Well, and not to go too down a rabbit hole, some of this is by design with lawyers. You can mask the fact that two people aren't actually agreeing on something with complex enough language that both sides can read into what they want and then sign it. And that style, that sort of like illusion of specificity, right? That can work its way into all sorts of legal writing, including handbook drafting, right? Like personal data. I love the policies like this. This isn't bad here, right? There are always opportunities to be like, where do our employees get this wrong? Where in our history have we seen folks make mistakes? And how do we head that off with a plain language statement in the employee handbook, right? And also, what's something that is kind of unique to you that the employees might not know about, right? Like, I'll give you a great example. Have you polled your IT department about what the latest phishing, scamming, like how have you been attacked recently? Instead of having this boilerplate, say, and then update this. Recently, these are the attacks you are most likely to see. And this is how you should deal with that. That requires you to update your handbook somewhat frequently, but it also means that people aren't going to just glaze over the passage on appropriate IT and company property use.
And this kind of personal narrative, even that you're talking about, right? That lands better. That is the narrative nature of it penetrates our brains better. So does second person language. These things like employees are responsible for notifying the company, right? All of a sudden, this is not a document directed at me. I don't have any part in what this, I mean, yes, I'm an employee. And we can't underestimate the power of the way our brains are wired. And our brains are wired essentially to ignore third-party language because it doesn't directly relate to us. So we've gone from this you up here. Whoops, excuse me, wrong color, right? But up here, if you believe you've been subject to unlawful discrimination, fantastic, right? Down here, again, timekeeping, your manager, your supervisor, excellent. Why? But then we get to this sterile stuff that makes us stop paying attention even as we read.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And when you point at this language about if the company determines that unlawful discrimination has occurred, it's nice to use the passive tense, the passive voice. Effective remedial action will be taken commensurate with the severity of the offense up to and including termination. We do not tolerate discrimination in the workplace. If we find that someone has intentionally discriminated against another employee, we're going to take appropriate measures, which might include firing the person. And I'll tell you, a statement that says we do not tolerate discrimination in the workplace is a more effective statement for me as your defense attorney to rely upon in saying we have an effective policy than, you know, I can't see it now because there's a line through it. If the company determines, right?
The company, by the way, is not going to determine anything.
Right.
Right? It's leaders in the company who are going to make these determinations. Maybe in partnership with HR, in partnership with attorneys, right? There is this distancing language in so many employee handbooks that almost make it seem as if the company does not actually want, the leaders of the company do not actually want to engage in leadership.
Well, there's just a lot of legal speak, use of the passive voice, and it's because it's what everybody does, right? This is not a specific criticism of this handbook. I don't think I've ever seen a handbook that doesn't include language like that.
Agreed. And that's one of the reasons that we're saying this is a best in class, or nearly best in class handbook. And it's that in class that you and I take exception with. And we're calling for a paradigm shift to create a whole new class of how we go about mitigating the risk and serving the employees who serve our mission as a company.
Well, and Aaron, there's a whole nother audience for this employee handbook, right? Which is equally important as the employee who is reading it. What about the manager who's applying it, right? And if your manager is reading this and the tone is either condescending or complicated, what tone are they going to take in their managing emails? And I will tell you definitively, the email that says, you are not meeting your performance expectations in the following manners, and if you do not correct this within X days, you will face disciplinary action up to and including termination of employment. That is not a helpful email. The email that says, hey, Tom, I noticed that your numbers dropped by 40%. Can you and I take some time to discuss this and see how I can help you bring those up? What don't you have?
Well, you know what I'm going to say.
Right.
And you know what I'm going to say is I love the direction you're going. I love the direction you're going. And I don't want that email to exist. What I want instead is at our weekly one-on-one, if you're my manager, I want you to say, Aaron, I'm glad we're together today because I've noticed this. Your close rate has dropped by 40%. And we need to talk about what are the reasons behind that and how can I help you bring it back up?
I will. So this is an area in which I think there's some, you got to leave some room for the unfortunate necessities of the legal world we live in. You want some kind of documentation, right?
I'm not saying no documentation. I'm talking about setting. I'm talking about doing it verbally first instead of record first.
Yes. And it's an art. It's an art to draft an email that is helpful instead of CYA, right? And maybe that's what a lot of what we're talking about in the employee handbook. You want an employee handbook that comes across as helpful, not just company CYA.
So let's look for a moment at a different handbook. This one is from a bank, and it's a bank you may have heard of. We've again changed the name to protect the innocent, and I've deleted lots of pages here. This handbook is 154 pages long, at least, until we get down to the personal family relationships at work policy, right? Which may itself be pages long. So we're looking at least 154 pages of handbook.
That's a lot, I mean, especially if it's not hyperlinked. It's what I'm reminded of is my oldest daughter's English essays, where she had a teacher who insisted that she follow a format which involved paragraphs that spanned entire pages. And the second you see a paragraph, a literal wall of text that goes across pages, you immediately start begging God not to have you read it, right? There's just not enough white space. And when you see an employee handbook that's 154 pages long, you start pleading, please do not make me read this whole thing. And it's very unlikely that your employees actually will.
Not only will I not read it, I'm not even going to crack it open. A 30-page handbook, I will at least kind of scan through, maybe read the parts that interest me. 154 pages is totally unapproachable.
And you can, as you've described it, you can have a 30-page employee handbook with a 200-page appendix, which says, here is all the nitty-gritty. And
all of which is hyperlinked.
Yeah, and if you click on the words, and actually I have several clients who have massive, it's not an employee handbook at that point, a massive employee encyclopedia, right? And most of it is behind hyperlinks that are easy to find and that you have to click on before you get disrupted from the flow, right? Like, here's what I can learn about the company I'm working at, right? Here's 25 pages. If I need more details, here's where they are, and they're easy to find.
So, looking at this page, let's look at this page for a moment. This is the first page of text in this bank's handbook. I would almost prefer that word welcome were not there. Because if you say welcome, and then there's nothing more about welcome, there's nothing more about how we're happy to have you here, there's nothing more about all of the incredibly qualified people that you beat out, and so how excellent must you be to be here? If there's only one word of welcome, I absolutely know for a fact, whether I'm correct or incorrect, as a new employee receiving this handbook, I know for a fact, and again, it may be incorrect, it doesn't change my knowledge, that you don't give a shit. You do not give a crap about making me feel welcome.
And let me be fair.
This is a one-word lip service.
This is not if the last handbook was an A student, this is not even a C student.
No, this is a solid B.
This maybe even a B plus, because this does the thing that this employer's employment counsel has told them it needs to do, right? It checks every legal box. It has all of the required policies, and it gives you the things to point at when you tell an employee, this is why you're in trouble, right? Here's the policy, right? That justifies why you're in trouble. Yeah. And so again, maybe I just represent a lot of companies, and so I'm very protective, right? I don't want to give the impression that this is somehow a bad employee handbook. These are just the room for going even further.
I have a different thought about this. I think this is a terrible employee handbook. Comparatively not terrible, right? Again, that B plus is graded on a curve. If the purpose of this handbook is to make sure that somewhere in all their stuff, the new employee has all of the information, whether they can find it and will ever familiarize themselves with it or not. If that's the purpose, right on. Well done, B plus. If the purpose is actually to be of service to the employee, C minus.
It's not as user friendly as it could be. It definitely.
Here's one thing in this handbook that I really do very much like, which is that, again, early on, we get into this employee assistance consulting, because very few employees and companies know that if they're dealing with any of these bullet points, that there's any recourse. None of them, very few people know that these things that we think we are alone with, we can actually get support with. So I love that this is kind of front and center.
Absolutely.
All the way down to, and here's one I didn't know, post-robbery support services. I had no idea. Right? How cool.
And it's also putting your money where your mouth is, right? Not we support you if, here is the resource that we have for you.
Now, you and I, we've both been to college and graduate school. We've looked at a lot of textbooks. Aaron, when was the last time you saw a glossary at the front of a text?
I'm a lawyer, so somewhat frequently, but I'm with you. I'm actually I have very strong opinions about how contracts should be drafted, and if you need a glossary at the beginning of a contract, you better really need a glossary, right? Because it's you're getting further and further away from plain English.
And you've asked me to read this document. You as the employee, as the employer, I'm a brand new employee. You've asked me to read this document. And then if you are this bank, you have made some of the first pages, 10 of them, glossaries. So there's no actual information here. There's only like if I go on to read the rest of the book, I'm going to have to keep referring back. So
Yeah,
again,
I was going to actually get a prop and kind of demonstrate this. Like I'll just pull something off my bookshelf, right? If I'm reading a book, and I'm reading a section, and I have to go, whoop, what does that mean? Okay, let's keep going. Oh, wait, what does that mean? Like that is hard to read, and when I read a lot of business contracts, that's how they read. And it would be better just integrate the definitions as you go, and even better, make your language simple enough that a glossary isn't as necessary.
and we've talked a lot about hyperlinks, and I don't remember what the technical term is for this, but we've all encountered those little the little information highlights where you can hover over that and up pops a little box that defines the term. Folks, again, we have the technology. Use the technology to make the information transfer easy and effective.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I can hear some of our listeners right now, Aaron, saying, like, as long as the information is there, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Why does it matter? And the reason that it matters is that everything communicates. And so much of communication is nonverbal, is in the subliminal levels. And if I'm reading this employee handbook, then I am feeling more and more outclassed, more and more threatened, more and more ill at ease. And instead of putting my time and focus into performing well for the company, I'm going to be putting my time and focus like an ibex on the plateau, keeping my eyes out for lions and just barely getting the work of the day done because I'm on constant high alert.
There's that phrase that the medium is the message, right?
Right on.
When I counsel employers on how to communicate with their employees, the style is at least as important as the substance. I can't count the number of ADA cases where a client technically did not follow the rules, but it was so clear that this employer was doing everything they could to try to help this employee succeed. When I go to mediation with those cases, the mediator is on my side. They're helping me settle that case for minimal dollars. On the other hand, when I have an employer client who has done everything technically correct, but you can just feel their desire to get that person out of here, right? To get rid of this employee who is costing more money than my other employees, even if they're technically correct, it's sort of like Jurassic Park. Nature will find a way. The legal system will find a way to allow you to get sued. And so when you're writing your employee handbook, are you technically correct, but telling the employee, we see you as a potential adversary or not, right? Like, to what extent does this document start feeling either adversarial or like the TPS report you've got to fill out from Office Space, right?
I love that. Yes, and I'm gonna say what you just said again because it's that important, that we are reading the message behind the message. And in improvisation, in theater improvisation, there's a dictum, an adage that it's never about the thing, it's always about the relationship. And so every sentence, every word in this document, your employees are asking themselves, how does this affect my sense of this relationship?
I'd take that a step further, Aaron. It's worse than that. They are not asking themselves that question. They are having that experience. They don't even realize it's happening.
Agreed.
Yeah, this happens all the time. The way in which we communicate to each other, aside from the literal meaning of the words, has an effect on us, which we don't even appreciate. Someone might not even know what the passive voice is, but they know that something's being like brushed past them. Don't look here.
Yes.
Right. There's no one actually doing anything.
We only kind of mean that we're going to take appropriate action.
Mistakes were made. Anytime someone hears the statement, mistakes were made, they immediately and instinctively know that the person making that statement is avoiding responsibility.
Yeah. Earlier we talked about that passage in the Better Handbook. If it is determined that discrimination has happened, essentially, right? That's very different from if you have been discriminated against, then it said appropriate action will be taken, right? It's like, well, who's doing the determining and who's doing the acting? It's like, well, not us.
Well, right? and not to mention in the post George Floyd world that we live in, how does that phrase hit? The passive voice, equivocal, is that the message you want to give? I think for a lot of employers, it probably isn't, right? I think in that language, which every single employment attorney 5 years ago would have just immediately blessed and like, yep, that's what you write. Is that still what we want to say? Or do you want a statement in your employee handbook that says, we do not tolerate discrimination? That doesn't mean you're going to fire the person who was the discriminator. That means the person who made an off joke that they didn't even realize the connotations of. Maybe that person is teachable, right? Because that is corrective action. That is going to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
Right? Like you are not hemming yourself in as much as you might think.
You just used the term corrective action, and I want to take a moment and ask you, Aaron, what are your thoughts about the word discipline in the workplace, and in particular in the employee handbook?
I think it's not to be too glib or obtuse, it's a word, right? It's a choice.
I can always count on you to state the obvious.
Yeah, well, but you might say in certain circumstances discipline because you want to evoke a parent scolding a child. That might be what you want to evoke.
Is it?
That's what you're doing. Well, it may be. No, I have clients. Like, I want to be fair here. I have clients. I had a client many years ago who was in a field that had some very difficult employees. And this employer viewed their employees as a kindergarten class, which they must keep order in. And they weren't going to beat around the bush that was the reality. And so for that reality, maybe you want to use the word discipline, corrective action, right? Maybe that's better for a situation where you're not looking at giving someone a spanking, but you're looking at actually correcting something that's gone wrong.
Well, and what do you think? I mean, you've known me for a while. If I had that team that you're calling kindergarten, do you imagine that I would have gotten better or worse results than the client that you're describing?
I don't know, Aaron. I mean, this is tough. Like, you might have a population of employees that are so resistant to reason, and they might be so transactional that the best you can do is tell them, if you do this, we will spank you. Right?
So now let's get away from the spanking metaphor for a moment. I am not what people might call permissive, though I am very, I hope, warm, encouraging, right? I am not talking about being lax on what are your standards for decorum and performance and things like that. That said, I went to a parochial high school where we were given the message in no uncertain terms: if you cheat, we will find you. We will know that you have cheated and you will fail this exam. And it became a game. And we cheated. Everybody in my class cheated in high school. And there is a true thing that people will occupy the role that you cast them in. And that word discipline carries this paternalistic implication. And it is no kind of stretch to call that paternalistic or to conjure up kindergarten. In college, a much more diverse population of students coming from all kinds of different backgrounds. The rule was professors could not be in the room when they conducted the exams. And it wasn't, we're going to discover and punish you. It was, we signed a pledge that said, essentially, I didn't cheat. And there was almost zero cheating in the school. I like the word corrective action, or at least I prefer it, because if you talk to people about discipline, they will say, oh yeah, try me.
Yeah, well, I think you make a very good point, Aaron. And I think what I would say fundamentally to employers is be intentional with your language at a minimum, right? You might argue about, do I have a room full of kindergartners or adults, right? But you need to be intentional about that choice that you're making. And you need to realize when you say discipline, you're invoking something, right? You're painting a certain picture. When you say corrective action, you're painting a different picture, right? It's the same reason why you might have a policy for one group of employees that says, on your first tardy, this happens. On your second tardy, this happens, right? And and for another group of employees, you might have something that says, don't be late. Be
Right.
respectful of our time.
Agreed.
Right? Or you might not even mention it. You might not even have a policy on being late.
Not written. You just have the conversation that says, hey,
right,
this is what the expectations are. I really want you to understand that. So continuing along that spectrum, there's discipline. I do not like it. Corrective action. I like this better. And then there's what I really prefer, which is consequences. And consequences are distinct from punishment. Punishment is what we do to make you pay for what you did. Consequences are actually neutral. They could be for better or for worse. And at their best, they are the natural outcome of the behavior that you exhibited, right? As a consequence of my dropping this object, it will fall to the ground. That is a natural consequence. As a consequence of your being late, you no longer get to work the opening shift because we need the store to open on time. And if you aren't going to be there on time, then we need to do something different so that we can get the outcomes we need. That's a natural outcome, and it is about the future. Consequences and corrective action are future focused. Punishment and discipline are past focused.
Well, and that kind of brings up kind of using a employee handbook as the first step in the alternative to the performance improvement plan. Instead of having a performance improvement plan, you have a document that sets the stage for maybe what I'd call a social contract, if I can go back to my poli-sci days. This is not me dictating to you what the deal is. This is me saying, look, these are the constraints. This is what we face as a company, right? These are the problems we face. This is what happens when these things don't get done or get done wrong, right? And this is what we as leadership have decided to do about it. Like, you don't want to be too cute, right? Because like there's this school of parenting where you say, well, you want to let the natural consequences, you want to let the natural consequences. At a certain point, I am in charge, and it is up to me to just set the consequences as I see fit, right? And I don't want to blow sunshine at my employees and pretend that they're in charge, because they're not,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
But I think it's important to get your employees to say, look, this isn't don't be late because it annoys me. It's don't be late because your colleague spent this time preparing this presentation and you won't get that information which you need, and it's not respectful to that person.
Right. Well, and it's as the leader of the company, if I'm the CEO, if I'm the owner, it is my responsibility that everybody here is treated with respect and experiences that respect. So it is a natural consequence for me to say, you cannot keep this job if you're going to provide the experience of disrespect to other people.
Let me recommend a heading for an employee handbook that employers should consider.
I love it. I can't wait.
It's called "What a Respectful Workplace Looks Like Here."
Our definition of respect in the workplace.
Yeah,
right.
And here are what you should expect from the workplace and what we expect from you. And if some pinched lawyer comes at me later and says, "Oh, you're setting yourself up to be sued if you don't follow this," I'm like, do you really think treating an employee disrespectfully without a policy is meaningfully better? Right? Like, well, we didn't promise to treat this employee with respect, so how could we be sued for it? Right? Like, I always tell employers that being crummy to someone will get you sued, regardless of whether or not there's an actual underlying discrimination claim.
Also, to the leader at home who is watching this, we are not making these suggestions to you if you don't share our values, right? If you aren't willing to be held to the standard of treating people with respect, then by all means, do whatever you want, right? We are speaking to the folks who really have as a heartfelt value the desire to treat people with respect, the desire for your workplace to be a place that people are happy to come to, and frankly, whether you want to do that because it's ethical or you want to do that because it actually is valuable for delivering business results, I'm reason agnostic. Whatever your reasons are for wanting a workplace of respect, if that is your desire, then this is guidance for you.
And I want to say definitively, I'm a moral objectivist here. I don't believe there's just people's opinions on whether or not respect is a good thing. In our legal system, if you do not treat your employees with respect, you will get sued exponentially more often, and you will lose those cases exponentially more often.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you will lose those cases whether you are legally in the right or not, because the jury isn't going to like you.
Exactly. It's that expression I used from Jurassic Park, nature finds a way. You can put all the safeguards in. When you start, disrespect is like playing with the genetic code of the dinosaurs. As soon as you start doing that, nature will find a way. You will find a way to get sued. And the reason why is everyone is in some protected class. I'm over 40. Maybe I have a minority religion. It doesn't even matter if it's a minority religion. Almost everybody is in some protected class. If you treat a person poorly, there's a claim there. Even if you didn't intend that membership in a protected class to be the reason why you treated them poorly, try convincing a jury that. Good luck.
All right. Well, we've been going for a while now, Aaron, and I know that, like, I haven't even touched more than half of my commentary on these two employee handbooks that we've been looking at. I think it's probably time for us to wrap. Again, folks, on January 8th, Aaron and I are going to be talking not specifically about employee handbooks, although there will certainly be overlap, I imagine. We're going to be doing a Q&A live with folks who would like to learn how can we mitigate the risk of having employees without undermining relationship with employees, without infantilizing or denigrating people, and without, maybe most importantly, from a business case perspective, without degrading performance. How can we mitigate the risk of having employees when what we're told we have to do maybe rubs us the wrong way, or we feel like is going to do one of these denigrating things that I talked about. Aaron, on this employee handbook question, what are your parting thoughts?
My parting thought is take everything we've said today not as some finger wagging things you have to fix, but as the permission and the freedom to do the things that you want to do, right? You want to treat your employees like human beings. You don't want to treat them like children. Very few company leaders be like, great, can I have some more legalese to stick in my documents, right? These are opportunities to be more authentic and to have the message that reflects your actual company culture, not the best practices guideline in some legal dusty horn book that's now 15 years old.
Yeah. I will leave you with this. Culture happens in subtle ways, in subtle realms, and the subtle stuff is the most powerful stuff. When you say our culture is, that's the least subtle and least powerful shaper of what your culture truly is. It's the subtle stuff. What is the message under the message that people are receiving when they read your handbook? And I encourage everybody, leaders especially, don't outsource your handbook crafting to your HR people or even worse, to some outside body. This is a document of leadership. And I encourage you to comb through your handbook and ask yourself, is this how I would want my kids spoken to in their workplace? Or if you don't have kids, my nephew, your cousin, right? Whoever is the tender person that you care about in your life, is it infantilizing? Is it mistrustful? Does it treat them with respect or speak to them as a valuable asset? Does it serve the company at the expense of the employee, or does it serve the employee in alignment with the company? Those are the questions that I encourage you to ask as you comb through your own employee handbook and think of that handbook as a document of leadership.
Well said.
All right. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Aaron Schmuckler on LinkedIn. Reach out to me if you'd like to be a part of that Q&A with Aaron Goldstein and myself. 1 week from yesterday, January 8th, I think we're going at 10:30 in the morning. So don't take my word for that. But if you'd like to be there, we'd love to have you. Talk to you soon.